The charity gala at the Beverly Hills Hotel was in full swing on that elegant October evening in 2015. The annual fundraiser for children's cancer research had attracted Hollywood's elite music industry legends and philanthropists from around the world, all gathered in the hotel's famous Crystal Ballroom to support a cause that touched many hearts. The atmosphere was sophisticated and refined, with soft classical music playing in the background as guests mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their designer gowns and tuxedos creating a sea of elegance under the sparkling chandeliers. The Beverly Hills Hotel itself added to the grandeur of the evening, its legendary pink exterior and opulent interior providing the perfect backdrop for one of Los Angeles's most prestigious charitable events. The Crystal Ballroom, with its ornate ceiling and French crystal chandeliers, had hosted countless memorable gatherings over the decades, but few would be remembered as vividly as what was about to unfold. Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne had been among the early arrivals, both looking magnificent in their formal attire. Sharon wore a stunning deep purple gown that complemented her silver hair perfectly, the fabric flowing gracefully as she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had attended hundreds of such events. Her jewelry, a diamond necklace and matching earrings that Ozzy had given her for their anniversary, caught the light as she gestured animatedly during conversations. She had been feeling particularly good that evening, her health stable for months following her successful treatment for colon cancer, and she was genuinely enjoying the opportunity to support a cause that had become deeply personal to their family. The couple had been through so much together over their decades-long marriage, his battles with addiction that had nearly destroyed him, her own health scares that had tested their bond, the challenges of raising children in the spotlight, and the constant pressures of maintaining careers in an industry that could be both rewarding and ruthless. Through it all, their love had not only endured, but had grown deeper and stronger, seasoned by shared trials and mutual support. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider leaving a like to show your support for stories about true love, loyalty, and standing up for those we care about most. Ozzy, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made him look every inch the distinguished gentleman, rarely left Sharon's side throughout the evening. The formal wear was a stark contrast to his usual casual attire, but he wore it with the same confidence he brought to everything else in his life. His hair was neatly styled, his famous cross necklaces replaced for the evening with elegant cufflinks, and his overall appearance reminded everyone present that he was as comfortable in Beverly Hills ballrooms as he was on rock concert stages. The couple had been circulating through the ballroom for over an hour, greeting old friends and meeting new supporters of the charity. Sharon, in her element as a consummate hostess and networker, was engaged in animated conversations about the foundation's work, sharing statistics about childhood cancer research and the urgent need for continued funding. Her passion for the cause was evident in every word she spoke, and several guests had already increased their planned donations after speaking with her. Ozzy provided his characteristic dry humor and surprisingly insightful comments about the importance of supporting medical research, drawing on his own experiences with health challenges and his appreciation for the medical professionals who had helped both him and Sharon through difficult times. Despite his reputation as rock's wild man, those who knew him well understood that he possessed a sharp intelligence and deep compassion that informed his approach to charitable work. The evening's program had included speeches from leading researchers, testimonials from families who had benefited from the foundation's work, and presentations about breakthrough treatments that were showing promise in clinical trials. Both Ozzy and Sharon had been visibly moved by the stories they heard, particularly those involving children who were fighting battles that no young person should ever have to face. As the formal program concluded and guests returned to socializing, the Osbournes found themselves near the silent auction tables, examining the various lots that had been donated by generous supporters. The items ranged from luxury vacations and fine art to exclusive experiences and signed memorabilia from entertainment industry legends. Sharon was particularly interested in a vacation package to Tuscany, discussing the details with another couple, the Harrisons, who were also considering bidding on the romantic getaway. "It sounds absolutely divine," Sharon was saying, her eyes bright with enthusiasm as she imagined the Italian countryside. "Ozzy and I haven't had a proper vacation in ages, and Tuscany has always been on our list." Margaret Harrison, A longtime friend and fellow philanthropist nodded in agreement. The vineyard tours alone would be worth the trip, and the cooking classes they're offering sound wonderful. It was during this pleasant conversation that Harrison Whitfield III approached their small group with the deliberate swagger of someone who believed his presence was always welcome. Whitfield was a man in his early 60s, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune that had been built over 3 generations, with the kind of old money arrogance that came from never having to earn anything through his own efforts. His great-grandfather had founded Whitfield Pharmaceuticals in the 1920s, and the family's wealth had grown exponentially through decades of strategic investments and business acquisitions. Harrison Whitfield III had inherited not only vast wealth but also the family's sense of entitlement and superiority that money alone could never justify. He was known in certain circles for his sharp tongue, his politically conservative views that often crossed into offensive territory, and his belief that his social status gave him the right to express opinions that others might find cruel or inappropriate. He had never worked a day in the family business, preferring to live off dividend payments while criticizing others for their work ethic and values. Whitfield had clearly been drinking heavily throughout the evening, his face flushed and his voice slightly slurred as he inserted himself into their conversation uninvited. His tuxedo, while expensive, was slightly disheveled, and his overall appearance suggested someone who had spent more time at the bar than participating in the charitable activities that were the evening's focus. He had harbored a long-standing dislike for the Osbournes, particularly Sharon, whom he viewed as representing everything he felt was wrong with modern celebrity culture. In his narrow worldview, people like the Osbournes, who had built their success through talent, hard work, and perseverance, were somehow less worthy of respect than those who had inherited their positions in society. Well, Whitfield said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby guests, his voice carrying the particular kind of venom that comes from someone who has been nursing grievances and liquid courage in equal measure. If it isn't Hollywood's favorite circus act, still playing dress-up with the grown-ups, I see. The initial comment was rude, but not yet devastating. Sharon raised an eyebrow at his approach, recognizing him as someone she had encountered at previous social events and remembered as being unpleasant. But she maintained her composure with the grace that had carried her through decades in the public eye. "Hello, Harrison," she replied evenly, though her tone carried a subtle warning that those who knew her well would have recognized. "I hope you're enjoying the evening and finding it educational about the Foundation's work." But Whitfield was just getting started, and alcohol had removed whatever filter might have normally prevented him from expressing his most toxic thoughts publicly. "Tell me, Sharon," he continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "are you still playing the victim card, or have you moved on to new ways of staying in the spotlight? It must be challenging to remain relevant when the reality shows dry up." The comment hit like a slap across the face, but it was only the beginning of what would prove to be a vicious and deeply personal attack. Sharon had been open about her health struggles, using her platform and her own experience to raise awareness about cancer, encourage early detection, and support other families going through similar ordeals. For Whitfield to characterize her advocacy as attention-seeking was not only cruel but represented a fundamental misunderstanding of her motivations and character. Sharon's face went pale, but she maintained her composure with the dignity that had carried her through countless challenges over the years. "I beg your pardon," she said quietly, though her voice carried an edge that suggested she was giving him one chance to reconsider his approach. The Harrisons and other nearby guests were beginning to sense that something unpleasant was developing, and several people started to look uncomfortable as they realized this wasn't just casual conversation, but the beginning of something more serious. Whitfield, emboldened by alcohol and his own sense of superiority, pressed forward with his assault, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was crossing lines that should never be crossed in civilized society. "Oh, come now. We all know how this works in your world," he said with a sneer that made his contempt obvious. "Cancer becomes your brand, your way of staying relevant when the cameras stop rolling and people stop caring about your opinions. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Just when your career needed a boost, along comes a sympathetic illness to generate headlines and public sympathy." The words hung in the air like poison, so cruel and inappropriate that several guests audibly gasped. The small group around them fell silent, shocked by the sheer callousness of his attack. Margaret Harrison put her hand to her mouth in horror, while her husband took a step back as if physically recoiling from Whitfield's words. Sharon stood frozen, not from fear but from the sheer audacity of someone attacking her health battles, her charitable work, and her integrity in such a vicious and public manner. The accusation was not only false, but represented everything that was wrong with cynical assumptions about people's motivations for helping others. But if Whitfield thought he was dealing with Sharon alone, or that his wealth and social position would protect him from consequences, he had made a serious and costly miscalculation. Ozzy had been examining a piece of artwork when the conversation began, engaged in his own discussion about the artist's technique with a collector who was explaining the historical significance of the piece. But Whitfield's first comment had drawn his attention immediately, causing him to pause mid-conversation as he registered the hostile tone being directed toward his wife. By the time the full insult was delivered, Ozzy was already moving, his body language shifting from casual social interaction to something much more focused and potentially dangerous. His face transformed from the pleasant expression he'd worn all evening into something that reminded everyone present why he had once been called the Prince of Darkness, not because of theatrical stage performances, but because he could tap into a primal intensity when the situation demanded it. The transformation was immediate and striking. The distinguished gentleman in the elegant tuxedo was suddenly replaced by someone whose presence commanded attention and suggested that crossing him would be a serious mistake. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, and his eyes took on an intensity that had intimidated everyone from record executives to unruly concert audiences over his decades-long career. "What did you just say?" Ozzy's voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a blade, causing conversations at nearby tables to stop abruptly as people turned to see what was happening. His Birmingham accent became more pronounced when he was angry, and right now it carried the full weight of 4 decades of commanding stages and confronting challenges that would have broken weaker individuals. The question wasn't really a request for clarification. It was a warning, a final opportunity for Whitfield to recognize the gravity of his mistake and attempt to make amends before facing the full consequences of his actions. Whitfield, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity of his situation or the caliber of opponent he was now facing, doubled down on his attack with the kind of arrogance that comes from a lifetime of believing that money and social position provide immunity from accountability. "I said your wife has turned cancer into a career move," he repeated, his voice carrying across the immediate area and causing even more guests to turn their attention toward the confrontation. "Quite profitable, I'm sure. All that sympathy and charitable donation money flowing in. Very clever marketing strategy, really." He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion that surprised everyone with its speed and precision, Ozzy stepped between Whitfield and Sharon, his body language conveying a level of protective fury that made several people step back instinctively. His movements were controlled but clearly dangerous, like a coiled spring that was barely containing enormous energy. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his eyes held an intensity that few had ever seen from him in public, even during his most notorious performances. The shift from distinguished gentleman to protective husband ready for battle was so complete and sudden that it left everyone witnessing it slightly breathless. This wasn't the wild man of rock and roll losing his temper in a predictable tantrum. This was something much more serious and controlled, the response of a man whose deepest values and most precious relationships were being attacked. "You listen to me very carefully," Ozzy said, his voice low but carrying clearly throughout the immediate area with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested enormous power being held in check. "I've spent my entire life dealing with critics, haters, and people who thought they could tear me down with words. I've been called every name in the book, had my character assassinated by better people than you, and survived attacks that would have destroyed weaker men." The words carried the authority of someone who had faced genuine adversity and emerged stronger, someone who had been tested by life in ways that Whitfield could never imagine. Every syllable was measured and deliberate, building towards something that everyone present could sense would be devastating. Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, but Ozzy held up a hand that stopped him cold. The gesture carried such authority that it seemed to physically prevent the other man from speaking, as if Ozzy had somehow gained control of the entire situation through sheer force of will and moral authority. "But you," Ozzy continued, his voice rising slightly but maintaining perfect control, each word chosen for maximum impact. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic existence. You just attacked my wife, the woman who saved my life more times than I can count. The woman who stood by me when I was at my absolute worst, when I was destroying everything good in my life, when I didn't deserve her loyalty or her love. By now, a significant portion of the ballroom had turned their attention toward the confrontation. Sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, the usual chatter of social events had died away, replaced by an expectant silence as people realized they were about to see something that would be talked about for years to come. The woman who fought cancer with more courage and grace than you've shown in your entire privileged existence, Ozzy continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word. The woman who turned her own suffering into a way to help others, who uses her experience to give hope to families going through hell, who raises money for research that might save children's lives. The moral authority in his voice was undeniable, backed by genuine experience and deep conviction. This wasn't a performance or a publicity stunt. This was a husband defending his wife with every ounce of passion and righteousness he possessed. Sharon doesn't use her cancer for attention, Ozzy said, taking a step closer to Whitfield, who was beginning to realize he had seriously misjudged both the situation and his opponent. She uses her experience to help other people facing the same battle. She raises money for research, provides support for families going through the worst time of their lives, and gives hope to people who might otherwise give up. Ozzy's voice was now carrying throughout a significant portion of the ballroom, channeling decades of performing experience into this very personal and passionate defense of his wife. The power and conviction in his words were affecting everyone who heard them, creating a ripple effect of emotional impact that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. "And you," he continued, pointing directly at Whitfield with barely contained fury, "you have the unbelievable arrogance to stand here in your expensive suit at a charity event supposedly supporting cancer research and attack someone who has done more to help cancer patients than you could accomplish in 10 lifetimes of your meaningless existence." The contrast being drawn was stark and undeniable, between someone who used her suffering to help others and someone who used his wealth to tear others down, between genuine contribution to society and inherited privilege squandered on cruelty. Whitfield's face had gone from flushed with alcohol to pale with the realization that he had not only insulted Sharon, but had done so in front of a room full of people who were now witnessing his character being systematically dissected by someone with far more moral authority than he possessed. The social consequences of this moment were beginning to dawn on him, but it was far too late for damage control. "Mr. Osbourne, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Whitfield began weakly. His earlier bravado completely evaporated as he tried to find some way to escape the consequences of his actions. "No misunderstanding," Ozzy cut him off sharply, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had heard enough excuses and equivocations to last several lifetimes. "You deliberately insulted my wife, questioned her integrity, mocked her health struggles, and suggested she was profiting from cancer, in front of a room full of people who know better, in front of me." By now, a significant crowd had gathered to witness this confrontation, including several celebrities, business leaders, charity organizers, and social prominent figures who understood they were watching something unprecedented in their social circles. Phones had appeared, though the intensity of the moment seemed to discourage casual recording. This felt too serious, too personal for social media entertainment. "Let me make something crystal clear to you and anyone else who might be confused about the kind of person my wife is," Ozzy said, his voice now carrying the full command presence that had made him one of the most powerful performers in rock history. "Sharon Osbourne is the strongest, most compassionate, most genuine person in this room, or any other room she enters. She's faced death and looked it in the eye without flinching. She's raised children, managed careers, built businesses, and helped countless people along the way." The words carried the weight of decades of shared experience, of someone who had witnessed firsthand the strength and character he was describing. This wasn't hyperbole or husband's bias. This was testimony from someone who had seen Sharon at her best and worst and loved her through all of it. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would become the most memorable and widely quoted part of his defense. "You, on the other hand, are nothing but a coward with inherited money and no character whatsoever. You attack people who are fighting real battles while you've never faced a genuine challenge in your entitled life. You're exactly the kind of person who makes the world a worse place simply by existing in it. And your presence here tonight is an insult to everyone who actually cares about helping others." The silence in the ballroom was profound and complete, broken only by the distant sounds of the hotel's operations and the soft classical music that continued to play despite the drama unfolding in the main gathering space. Whitfield stood there, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, looking like a schoolchild who had been caught in a serious misdeed and was facing consequences far beyond what he had expected. The social dynamics of the room had shifted completely, with Whitfield now clearly isolated and judged by everyone present, while Ozzy commanded respect and support from the gathered crowd through the sheer moral force of his defense. "Here's what's going to happen," Ozzy continued, his tone becoming even more authoritative as he outlined the immediate consequences of Whitfield's behavior. "You're going to apologize to my wife, not because I'm making you, but because it's the right thing to do and because she deserves your respect and the respect of everyone else in this room." Whitfield looked around the ballroom, seeing dozens of faces watching his every move, many of them belonging to people whose opinion of him would matter significantly in his business and social circles. The weight of his mistake was becoming clear, but his apology, when it came, was grudging and clearly motivated by embarrassment and social pressure rather than genuine remorse. "Mrs. Osbourne, I apologize if my comments were inappropriate," he mumbled, unable to meet Sharon's eyes as he delivered the half-hearted attempt at making amends. "If," Ozzy repeated, his voice sharp with disgust at the qualified nature of the apology. "If they were inappropriate, you just told a cancer survivor that she was faking her illness for publicity. You questioned her integrity, mocked her charitable work, and suggested she was profiting from other people's suffering. There's no if about the inappropriateness of your behavior." The inadequacy of Whitfield's apology only served to highlight his lack of genuine remorse and his continued failure to understand the gravity of what he had done. It was clear to everyone present that he was apologizing only because he had been caught and humiliated, not because he understood why his words had been so harmful. But Sharon, who had been watching this entire exchange with a mixture of love, pride, and amazement at her husband's fierce protection, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Ozzy's arm, her touch immediately calming his visible anger. "It's all right, darling," she said softly, though her voice carried clearly in the silent ballroom. "Mr. Whitfield has apologized and I accept it. Some people simply don't understand what they're talking about when it comes to cancer, and I hope he never has to learn through personal experience what it's really like." The grace in her response, the dignity with which she handled both the attack and its aftermath, only served to highlight the enormous contrast between her character and Whitfield's behavior. Several people in the crowd nodded approvingly at her measured response, and the difference between her class and his boorishness became even more apparent. But Ozzy wasn't finished. He turned back to Whitfield with an expression that made it clear the apology was only the beginning of the consequences for his actions, not the end of them. "Now," Ozzy said, his voice carrying final authority, "I think it would be best if you left. This is a charity event for cancer research, and your presence here is an insult to everyone who's been touched by this disease, everyone who's fighting this battle, and everyone who genuinely cares about helping others." Whitfield nodded quickly, clearly eager to escape a situation that had become deeply humiliating and potentially damaging to his reputation in ways that would extend far beyond this single evening. As he hurried toward the exit, several guests deliberately turned their backs to him, making their disapproval clear through body language that spoke louder than words could have. The path to the exit seemed to stretch endlessly as Whitfield made his way through the crowd, feeling the weight of judgment and disapproval from every direction. His social standing, carefully maintained through decades of inherited privilege, had been severely damaged in just a few minutes of poor judgment and cruel behavior. Once Whitfield had left the ballroom, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many people approached Ozzy and Sharon to express their support, admiration, and solidarity. The incident had revealed something beautiful about their relationship and Ozzy's character that impressed everyone who witnessed it. "That was absolutely incredible," said Margaret Harrison, her voice filled with emotion as she approached the couple. "I've never seen anyone defend their spouse with such passion and eloquence. That was love in action." Others echoed similar sentiments, praising not only Ozzy's fierce protection of Sharon, but also the articulate and principled way he had delivered his defense. This wasn't the wild man of rock and roll losing his temper in an unpredictable outburst. This was a husband who loved his wife deeply and had the moral authority and verbal skills to defend her against unfair attacks. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, one of the leading cancer researchers whose work the foundation supported, approached them with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Osbourne, your advocacy work has meant so much to our patients and their families. What Mr. Osbourne said tonight, every word was true. You've helped more people than you'll ever know." Sharon, still somewhat shaken by the unexpected assault on her character, but bolstered by the overwhelming support from the crowd, squeezed Ozzy's hand as they made their way to a quieter corner of the ballroom, where they could have a moment to process what had just happened. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude and love. "I didn't know how to respond to something so cruel and personal. I was just frozen." "You never have to face anything like that alone," Ozzy replied, pulling her close in a gesture that was both protective and tender. "Anyone who wants to attack you has to go through me first, and I promise you that won't end well for them. Not ever." The story of Ozzy's passionate and articulate defense of Sharon spread quickly through social media and entertainment news outlets. But the focus wasn't on drama or conflict for its own sake. Instead, people were moved by the demonstration of true love and partnership that the incident had revealed, the example of what it looks like when someone is willing to fight for the person they love most. Videos of Ozzy's speech, recorded by guests on their phones, despite the serious nature of the moment, went viral not because of any celebrity scandal, but because they showed something beautiful and increasingly rare. A husband who would stop at nothing to protect his wife's honor, dignity, and reputation from unfair attack. The incident also sparked broader conversations about how cancer survivors are sometimes treated in public discourse, with Sharon's advocacy work receiving renewed attention and support from people who had been moved by Ozzy's defense of her integrity and his passionate explanation of her genuine motivations for helping others. In the days following the gala, Sharon received hundreds of messages from cancer survivors and their families, thanking her for her advocacy work and expressing admiration for the way she had handled such a difficult situation with grace and dignity. Many shared their own stories of facing similar skepticism or cruelty from people who didn't understand the realities of cancer treatment and recovery. Whitfield, meanwhile, found himself persona non grata at many social events throughout Beverly Hills and beyond, as word of his behavior spread through society circles. His pharmaceutical company issued a statement distancing itself from his comments, and several charitable organizations quietly removed him from their boards and donor lists. He eventually made a more sincere public apology, acknowledging that his words had been inexcusable and announcing a significant donation to cancer research in Sharon's name. For Ozzy and Sharon, the incident became another milestone in their enduring love story, proof that their bond had not only survived decades of challenges, but had grown stronger and deeper through each trial they faced together. That night had shown the world something they had always known, that true love means being willing to fight for your partner, to defend them against any attack, and to stand together against whatever life might throw at you. The charity gala raised more money than ever before in its history, partly due to the renewed attention brought by the incident, and partly because people were inspired by the example of genuine commitment and advocacy they had witnessed. The foundation's work received unprecedented media coverage, leading to increased awareness and support for childhood cancer research. Years later, when people asked Ozzy about that night, he would always give the same response: "Nobody attacks my Sharon. Nobody. She's been through enough battles for one lifetime, and she's won every single one with more class and courage than anyone has a right to expect. My job is to make sure she never has to fight alone, and I take that responsibility seriously. Anyone who thinks they can hurt her without consequences has seriously misjudged the situation." The incident became part of their family legend, a story that their children and grandchildren would hear about the power of standing up for the people you love, and the importance of defending those who are fighting difficult battles with grace and determination. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of true love and loyalty, please consider leaving a like. Sometimes the most romantic gesture isn't flowers or jewelry. It's being willing to stand up and fight for the person you love when they need you most. True partnership means facing the world together, protecting each other, and never letting anyone tear down what you've built with love.